So today we're delighted to have as our speaker, Dr. Michael Widener, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Transportation and Health in the Department of Geography and Planning, and the incoming Director of Health Studies at the University of Toronto, Canada. He received his PhD in Geography at the University at Buffalo State University of New York, his Master's of Science at Florida State University, and his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Widener is primarily interested in topics related to health, transportation, and urban geography and planning. His current research projects explore the impact of the built environment on food access and dietary behaviors, how older adults' mental health and well-being is affected by their mobility options, and the links between time use and health outcomes. So welcome, Dr. Widener, and I'll turn things over to you.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Tracy, and thanks to the organizers, including myself, I guess. So we'll all be presenting a bit of our work in the coming weeks. So I hope you all stick around for Chris's talk, and if you haven't seen Tracy's, I believe it was recorded a week or two ago. So as a part of this series, we all decided that it would be a great idea to provide a bit of background to our own areas of expertise and try to connect it back to this idea of the importance of supply chains in the areas of food and health. And so as somebody who does work on urban food environments, or that's my primary area of research, it gave me an opportunity to kind of explore the connections of food retail environment research to supply chains. And of course they are connected because retail is connected to the supply chain network. And so I just want to preface this by saying two things. So the first is I am not an expert in supply chains, but I know enough to sort of understand where the connections are occurring as they link to my area of expertise. And second, my cat is lurking in the background here. And so if my screen suddenly changes or I am muted, that is why, and I will try to fix the situation as soon as possible. So with those two things said, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so go up. Okay, so in this talk, I want to explore a number of areas, and again, what I'm trying to do is just kind of connect this area of research on food environments that I'm involved in back to supply chains. And so the first thing I want to ask is how does the geography of food retail connect to supply chains? And so we'll kind of explore that a little bit, and then move towards what are urban food retail environments, how are they defined, what do they look like, and why do we care? What's the point of understanding what an urban food retail environment is? Next, how can we improve research on food environments? And so this is just a short side on some of the work that my group is doing currently. And then finally, I want to ask the question, will any of this matter in 5 to 10 years? And we'll get to that at the end. And as I say with my little emoticon here, who knows, maybe it will, maybe it won't. So to sort of start with that first question about the geography of food retail and how it links to supply chains, I think it's always a good idea to step back and think a little bit about the history of food retail. And so to do that, we can sort of explore in Toronto the evolution of urban food stores. And I know there's at least one historical geographer in the audience, and maybe they'll appreciate this or correct me later. But a lot of food purchasing in urban settings before the sort of widespread adoption of self-service supermarkets and grocery stores was done at these general stores. And so in Toronto, we see a couple examples here. This is from the Toronto Public Library of what general stores look like, and we see they're called grocery. They have groceries in their signs. On the right-hand side, that's a general store in Scarborough in the 19th century. And these stores stocked a lot of non-perishable items, so your flours and salt and things like that. And they would sometimes have fresh produce and those sort of things. But the stocking of these stores was done depending on the location, oftentimes by a cart and buggy here or a horse and buggy here with you can see it on the right-hand side. They moved the supplies to the stores through the city in this way. And so it's very much dependent on sort of the transportation infrastructure, what they were able to stock. Now, the food retail environment in cities, of course, changed pretty rapidly in the 20th century. We start to see larger markets, public markets emerge as cities began to grow. So we see a lot of urbanization at the start of the 20th century. And with that, we see the growth of public markets. So many of these were founded in North America in the mid 19th century, like St. Lawrence Market here on the left. And you can see it's sort of in the dense old part of the city, the original or one of the original St. Lawrence Market buildings here on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the current St. Lawrence Market situated on Front Street. Now, connecting this back to supply chains, I think what's important to remember here is the location of Front Street in the 19th century was actually on the waterfront, right? So we see the location here circled in red, and it's connected to the ports. The ports the port is able to sort of provide easy access to ships moving produce and other dry goods and other food items back and forth between markets. And so it's well situated here. And now we see lots of other public markets throughout the city and across North American cities, which I'm primarily focusing on. Lots of opportunities for people to purchase things like vegetables, fresh produce, lots of other types of food. Now, after World War II, especially, we begin to see a continued evolution on how our food is distributed in cities. And so on the left hand, well, on both sides here, we see the Ontario Food Terminal, which was designed to replace a wholesale fruit market near the St. Lawrence Market in the middle 20th century. And what you'll notice is there's rail cars here in the lower right-hand side of the left-hand image. And you can see the actual connection to the rail line in the satellite image on the right, or the aerial image on the right. You can see it's nicely connected to the rail. We see that there's lots of cars there. This is where fruit and veg were transported from a lot of the farmers in Ontario. And this was sort of spurred in part by a desire for Ontario farmers to boost demand for their products, because with after World War II, we see a huge increase in production, lots of efficiencies, more food being produced, and this was a new way to sort of get that food to the markets. You'll also notice sort of a very skinny looking Gardner Expressway just to the south of it there. Now today, on the left-hand side, we see the Ontario Food Terminal in its present form, and you see it's grown quite a bit. It's lost its connection to the rail infrastructure, and it's been replaced by essentially truck parking and truck terminals. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a similar type of facility out in Ajax, the Loblaws distribution center, with a similarly large building with lots of access points for these big semi-trucks to sort of get their food delivered to the distribution center. Whatever happens to the food in there, packaged, repackaged, split up, shipped around, and then moved to another truck to go to a market for people to buy. Now, this brings us finally to the end user, which is what I'm really interested in. If I can change my slide. And here we'll see the connection to the end user, the supermarket or grocery store, which is where most people are buying their food in the early 21st century. And one thing you'll notice, so on the upper left-hand side, we have a grocery store at Bathurst and DuPont. Down on the lower left-hand side, we've got one at Jarvis, and I think Front, I forget the exact road. And another one here, this is a more suburban one on the center top. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we've got a smaller grocery store near Spadina and King. Now, there's a few things you'll notice. One of the things is that they all have ample parking, especially or even those that are in a pretty dense parts of the city. So this is very much a car-oriented way of accessing food for the most part, with maybe the exception of the store down in the lower right-hand corner. And the second thing is we have, as a part of this, we have easy access for the trucks that are delivering the goods and products to these stores. And so we have terminals essentially, or bays, ready for access, easy to access for these distribution points. And so the design of these stores is very much considering the types of ways that the food is coming from the distribution points or the food terminals to the point where they're going to meet the end user. And so with that, we start to see some implications for the actual distribution of this type of food retail in our cities. Now, in places like Toronto and New York, Chicago, bigger cities across North America, we do have some exceptions to this rule. These will have sort of smaller grocery stores that are more sort of walking, accessible by walking or biking or transit. But across many cities in North America, really this sort of supermarket style with parking, easy access bays for trucks, usually access to relatively high order roads is going to be what you'll see. So all of these things have kind of led to then what I would argue is a supermarket standard. So we have shifts in transportation, we have suburbanization, the globalization of agriculture, industrial agriculture, so higher yields, and many other factors, all kind of coming together to sort of produce a type of store where people tend to buy food in North American settings and in many other parts of the world that sort of lends itself to this efficient kind of large scale supermarket. So there's efficiencies in having bigger stores. You can have more stuff there. You can sort of distribute, you have fewer places to distribute food. You can do it in a more efficient way. And these sort of big format stores or larger format stores have pretty major implications for store geography, which is very nicely demonstrated by Jason Gilliland and his at the time master's student, Christian Larson, in a paper they wrote in 2008, where we see the distribution of supermarkets in London, Ontario in 1961, and then again in 2005. And so they did a really nice job of sort of just illustrating sort of how the shift in demand, so the suburbanization, the sort of emptying of the downtown by a lot of people, and the resulting redistribution of supermarkets. Now, this is an issue because when I say emptying of downtown, that's not quite true. Of course, there's a lot of people who still lived in our downtowns, even when suburbanization was happening. And oftentimes these are racialized populations or lower income populations. And so there's now this sort of issue where we start to see that the sort of the evolution of the food store into these sort of larger, efficient supermarkets is potentially leaving behind populations that may be more vulnerable to some of these changes and resulting in sort of negative outcomes like worse nutritional outcomes or sort of downstream health effects. And that led to this model that has sort of driven a lot of food environment research to this day, where we start with access. So do you have access to a food store? And if you do, we assume then there's this connection to diet. And then if you are having, so if you have access to healthy food, then your diet will be better. And if your diet is better, then you'll have better health outcomes. If you have access to less healthy outlets, then maybe your diet will be worse, and then you'll have worse health outcomes. And so it's a very simple model. It's kind of nice and clean, but as I'll address later, there are, of course, some issues with this. Now, the model has resulted in quite a few papers, I should say probably hundreds of papers on food environments, and it's sort of driven the way people thought about this for quite a while, but that's beginning to change, and I'll discuss that. So one of the best illustrations, I would say, of how this model was dictating policy and how people thought about access to food, so how do end users get the food they need to survive, is the food desert mapper that was done by the US Department of Agriculture in the early 2000s. It's been updated. It's now the Food Access Research Atlas. And we can see here that there are food deserts everywhere, as according to the USDA. Whether or not this is a helpful type of map is something we can discuss maybe afterwards. And I just want to zoom into one city in particular. So this is Cincinnati, Ohio. I had my first academic job. And any of the green shaded tracks here, the city is outlined in a bold white, are considered a food desert of some sort or another by the USDA map. And so we see that, these are pretty general measures that, like basically we see over half of the city by area is considered to be a food desert of some sort or another, which what do you do about that? There are lots of supermarkets in the city, but the way that these things are being measured is not very precise or nuanced, which sort of brings into question the utility of them. Now, this food desert concept, of course, is not something that's unique to the US. In Canada, we have examples here. There was a Toronto food desert map that somebody made in the early 2000s, published in an MIT book. And we see that there are these gaps. So anywhere shaded in green is nearby a restaurant or grocery catchment area, and that how they define that is kind of unclear. And anywhere that isn't shaded in green is what they're calling a food desert. But if we just do a little bit of investigation as to what these gaps actually represent, we see one of the biggest gaps is, of course, Bridle Path, the Bridle Path, also known as Millionaire's Row. It's where very fancy people live. And if any of you live there, then I guess you're a very fancy person in my mind. But we do also see in other parts of the city, for example, in Scarborough and in Rexdale and parts of Western Etobicoke, similar gaps. Now, how do we deal with this, though? I mean, there's some weird things happening where we have some of the wealthiest and some of the poorest parts of the city both identified as food deserts. This brings me to thinking that this kind of measure, these sort of basic distance measurements, are not really a good way to start thinking about access to these food retail sites and the geography of those food retail sites, because the location decisions they're making are much more complicated than that. They're driven by a lot of different other factors. Now, I just like showing this map. This is my favorite map that I've ever made. And it is a map of the drive time to the nearest quote unquote healthy food retailer in Toronto. So if you have a car and there isn't traffic, everyone in the city can get to a food retailer in 10 minutes or less by car. Now, if there isn't traffic or if you have a car, those are big question marks, but I just like showing it because it's all green. Now, if we complicate it a little bit more by looking at the variation in access by transit, so this is averaged over the course of an hour during the middle of the day, we do see that there's still pretty good spatial access to these healthy food retailers throughout the city, with maybe some exceptions like in the Bridle Path and a lot of the industrial areas like the airport out in the west of the city. So this is one way that people are measuring the food retail environment. They're just saying, well, where do people live? Where are the food stores? And how far away are they? That can be simple measures like the food desert one that we looked at earlier, where it's just, are people within a mile or a kilometer of a food retailer that we deem to be healthy? Or it can be more complicated by looking at modes of transportation like we did here, looking at transit commute times to these food retailers from various places. Now, one of the biggest ways that folks have measured food retail environments is through the Mrfei, the Modified Retail Food Environment Index, which takes the number of healthy food retailers, divides it by the total sum of all food retailers in some geography. And so I just put together a couple of examples of what this looks like in Toronto and Vancouver. And this provides a slightly different way to measure the food environment by just giving a sense of, well, what's the composition of the food retail in any particular location? Now, of course, this still has its own issues. Like, as you see in this map, downtown Toronto has a very bad or low Mrfei score because the denominator is huge, right? We have lots of food retailers in downtown Toronto, which is right here, just in case you aren't having trouble locating it. And because that denominator is big compared to other parts of this region that we're looking at, we're going to see a low MRFEI score. And then we can identify different areas throughout the city, but in very populated areas, some of the nuance of what these stores are and how people are accessing them get a bit lost. Likewise, in Vancouver, we have a similar situation with downtown Vancouver being a quote unquote bad MRFEI score. And then we see sort of these more sort of peripheral areas having these higher levels. And some of that has to do with the actual composition of food retail, but some of it just is more to do with the fact that by nature of the store type, there are going to be more convenience stores and fast food stores than there are going to be large format grocery stores or supermarkets or warehouse stores that are just bigger, so you need fewer of them. The scale is an issue. So these are two of the ways that we will commonly see food environments measured. Now, that sort of brings us then to why are we doing that? And I kind of mentioned before, the model is thinking about access, its relationship to diet, and then health. And these measures do provide some easy ways to sort of build and visualize and understand the food environment. And it captures some basic principles of friction of distance and maybe lack of resources. If you're considering something like only looking at lower income zones and their access to food retail. But when we actually look at studies that are trying to link the geography, an individual's geography or their food environment to some outcome, we tend to see a lot of inconsistent results. And so this is a bit of an older list, and there's updates to this, but we see plenty of studies that say, yes, having good food retail environments means we're going to see better dietary and health outcomes. And then we see plenty of other studies that say there's no results, and sometimes we even see mixed signals in our models where maybe they don't have or there's a negative effect of being near a supermarket, for example. And a lot of that has to do with this. Access is really complicated. It's not just about that spatial component. It's about how much time you have. It's about your partner, if they're able to also go to the store. It's about your economic resources. But then downstream, your diet is also going to be complicated by a number of other factors, and so is your health, right? So you may be the lucky person who can eat a hamburger and French fries for every meal for every day of the rest of your life and have no adverse health outcomes because of it. You may just be that lucky person. But we know at a population level, of course, that would not be a good idea. We want to sort of encourage healthy diets because we know that these things lead to better health outcomes. But at the individual level, there's a lot of other things at play. And to sort of simplify it or try to simplify it to just this spatial component is a little naive, I think. And so that leads me then to thinking about what are the complications. So I've broken them down into sort of 4 different components, and we can do this many different ways. But just for the sake of this talk, I've said, okay, well, we have individual level dynamics. So people are interacting with their environment in different ways. They're moving. They have time to do things sometimes and not others. There are household coordination considerations that we have to think about. So are there kids in the house? Are you physically able to do cooking activities? Does your partner do all the cooking and shopping? There's, of course, then individual level heterogeneity, so social and political and economic capital. And all of these things have started to become incorporated into some food environment research over the last decade or so. Now, that sort of leads me to this one thing that kind of connects us back to the end user in the supply chain, which is that there's surprisingly little academic literature on the behaviors of grocery shoppers. Now, there's the odd paper in business journals here and there. There's a ton of research internal to grocery store and supermarket corporations. They know a lot about how people shop for groceries. They have the shopper cards and your whatever loyalty cards that will track everything you do with their store. But people are now starting to try to make this connection between geography and individual heterogeneity and actual grocery shopping behavior, which will then hopefully provide maybe a better signal towards diet and health outcomes as we go. So I sort of encouraging folks to move away from these aggregate level studies to individual level analyses, because even if we find relationships at the aggregate level, the mechanisms that drive them are still kind of unclear in the public. Now, there's these opportunities then to sort of link these specific behaviors to the geographies and outcomes. And there's, of course, downstream going to be lots of opportunities for natural experiments as maybe a new supermarket comes online or grocery delivery becomes more prominent, and so on and so forth. And just as a note, like, there are things going on. There have been academics who have had access to some of these loyalty card programs. There's just not much out there in the academic literature. We're working with a tech company now that has some of this data through the circulars that are produced, and we're hoping that we'll be able to provide some new information in this regard down the line. But for now, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ways people are complicating the sort of food environment research. One of the ways is to collect individual level data, movement data. So here's a three-dimensional image of a GPS trajectory. Those are the black dots. The third dimension here is showing how much time they spend in any particular space. And all those little blue and green balls are the food retailers in this particular zone. And so we can kind of get a better idea of how this particular individual is exposed or has access to different types of retail. And using these methods, we've started to see quite a few papers come out that are finding maybe more consistent relationships between these dynamic exposures and different outcomes. A lot of stuff on food, fast food consumption. We've done a couple papers and seen pretty consistent results. A number of other groups, like Jason's at Western, has also explored this, I think, with children. And so that's all well and good, but the type of food retailer that we're looking at here, fast food, is maybe sort of different than what we're thinking about with more regular grocery shopping. So the scale at which one goes to buy groceries is going to be different than fast food. The exposure is going to be a different type of exposure, and so on. And so one of the things we're doing now in my group through the food activities socioeconomics time use and transportation study that I'm running is trying to look at how partnered couples in the same household are divvying up tasks. And so we're able to then see how different partners take on different roles and how that labor plays out across variables like gender. Now, in this particular case, all of our sample only had male and female partners. So there was only male-female coupled partners in our sample. But what we began to notice is that when we look at how their different trajectories played out over space and time, was there were actually pretty important differences in what each member was exposed to in our small sample. And in particular, we found that the women in our coupled partners tended to have higher densities of food retailers across the various ways we could measure exposure through path areas or activity locations or weighting by time, any of those things. And that's interesting because the general area of activity spaces, the regions in which people travel over time, were much larger for the men in the coupled partners. So we see that that the types of labor, the sort of gendered labor of food shopping is really coming into play here. And this is important because a lot of studies to this point have really focused only on sampling one person from a household, and whether they get the whole picture or not is in question. Another example from the same study, we have some time use data for all of our participants linked to GPS trajectories. And so we can see just the sampling here. Essentially, each color represents a type of activity. The light gray is sleep. And each of these activities can be linked then to their GPS traces, which are shown in aggregate on the right. And that gives us a sort of locational channel. It gives us a location dimension to every type of activity, which gives us the ability to think about food access in a more sort of a complex way. And one thing we're doing right now is clustering these participants into different types. And so we see we're using Ward's method to use two channels. One is the activity channel, the other is the locational channel. And that gives us a number of different types of participants. For example, type 1, I believe here, we see sleeping at night, the dark gray is working, and then a number of other activities sort of smattered throughout the day. Type 2, they're sleeping at night, and then they don't have working activities during the daytime, but you have this sort of corresponding locational channel. So these are the same users. The dark gray here is at home, the green is in the neighborhood, and yellow is beyond the neighborhood. So we see that these are probably commuters going to work. So they're at home, they're in their neighborhood, and then they're beyond their neighborhood for most of the day, and then they come home. But type 2, on the other hand, tends to spend all their time at home or in the neighborhood with a few trips outside. Now, what's interesting for us is now we can see how the couples in our study of different types relate to each other. So is it the case that type 1s and type 2s tend to be coupled together, or maybe if we have a household of two type 1s, there's going to be different ways of accessing food. So the end user is going to be more, they're going to have more complex behaviors about procuring food for their household. Maybe it relates to different types of dietary outcomes or cooking behaviors, and potentially health outcomes downstream. But this is sort of preliminary work. I just wanted to sort of show where this stuff is going. Now, as I've sort of shown, modeling food environments isn't so simple. We can do the simple geography of where food retailers are and where people are and see how far away they are together. But the other thing besides individual dynamics that are at play is the dynamics of our urban environment. And so the temporal scale of how we think about our urban environments also matters. Usually we just sort of take it as static and forget that there's agency in our food retailers. Food retailers make decisions to locate in specific places. Just as an example here, we have a paper that I had done a while ago on what happens to access to healthy food retail in Buffalo over the course of the year. And essentially when farmers markets open, we tend to see a big jump in access to these healthier food retailers. Now that there's a lot of complications with that. Farmers markets aren't equivalent to sort of brick and mortar supermarkets. But this is just demonstrating there's that sort of change in the food environment as the seasons change. And you could play this out for any number of types of stores or temporal scales. Alternatively, in health geography, we've also seen a number of studies do things like use, in this case, this was a paper I did a while ago using a capacitated median model to sort of optimally locate mobile food markets where there was a low access to supermarkets. And so we used the fancy linear programming model to say, hey, well, if we're gonna take all these trucks and move them throughout the city, where should they go? And so this again was in Buffalo, and we see these triangles represent the locations of where the food markets would be, or the mobile markets would be best positioned across space, accounting for the demand, assuming that demand would be higher in those locations that have less access to supermarkets. Now, this kind of gets us back to the original point, which is that supply chains are definitely connected to the food environment, but how? What is the specific way in which they're changing the geography of food? And I think one way to think about it is by realizing that supply chains respond to consumers, and then that consumer demand is then shaped by that response. So the food retail geography that is presented to them, but then the food retail geography is shaped by supply chains. So we see over the long temporal scale shifts in, for example, transportation modes, which results in different types of food retailers, which results in different geographies of food retailers, which results in different consumer preferences. Now, this is all really interesting, and I think a lot of this is going to then affect the actual dietary behaviors we're interested in modeling and observing. But one of the things, that sort of last question, will any of this matter in 5 to 10 years? I don't know. Grocery delivery service has the potential to basically say, well, space, the food distribution space is maybe less relevant because everything can be delivered. I'm skeptical because I actually think that the delivery technology and infrastructure isn't quite there to make this happen anytime soon. I also think that this will be a very sort of privileged way of getting your food store. There's still a markup on getting groceries delivered in this way. So in the pandemic, a lot of people have turned to this service, but you're paying for the delivery fee, you're paying for a tip to the deliverer, potentially. In some cases, there are markups. Some cases there aren't. They're trying to sort of carve out a space in the market. But I don't really know what's going to happen with grocery delivery services. I think that brings a lot of things into question. And I think it's a really interesting question for us as a group to explore as we continue to talk about food supply chains and how they may impact health as things move on. So with that, I'll bring my talk to a conclusion. I just want to thank briefly Lindsay Smith and Bochu Liu, who were both helping out on a number of these projects, and a number of other students and RAs. Lauren Jewett helped with the initial data collection for FAST, and a number of other RAs in our department were participating in collecting the data. I'm happy to answer questions if there's time, and feel free to follow me on Twitter. And thanks for your attention. I'll end the slideshow here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. We have about 20 minutes for questions if people have questions or comments they'd like to make. And you can do that by either raising your hand, and we should see you in the participant list, or typing a message into the chat function. Maybe while we wait, I'll ask my first question, Michael. How did you collect the activity and location data? Was that a phone app you developed, or did you have people making a record and wearing watches, or how did you do that?
That's a great question. So the GPS data was collected using a phone app, which was a bit of a hassle because phone hardware makes a difference when you're doing GPS data collection. But we got it to work relatively well. The time use data, the activity data, was using a format of a time use diary that was developed. It's called the Harmonized European Time Use Survey. And so we took that format and sort of altered it for our purposes a bit. And that was a paper diary. We did toy with making it also a phone app. I skipped over a lot of information about our sample and who was in it and who wasn't, but this was a sort of lower income, but not quite like maybe the lower middle income population for the most part. And we were all already asking for them to do quite a bit of work. The phone app was going to be a lot more work for them. It was actually kind of complicated when we talked about doing it. So the paper survey was actually quite streamlined, and folks found it relatively intuitive, though there is some variation in how well they filled it out. But to answer your question, it was a paper diary, and we used the smartphones, as a way to collect the GPS data.
Really interesting.
I guess I answered all the questions, then. That's good.
So I had a question, if I can jump in. So I've noticed one of the things that's happened in sort of the Toronto neighborhood, and I suspect a little bit more broadly, at least in Ontario, is with Loblaws buying Shoppers Drug Mart. There's now a lot more little grocery stores because a whole bunch of Shoppers Drug Marts are actually carrying Loblaws supplies. And I guess there's two questions about that. One on the user side, right? Is this going to actually improve? Is this, an example of healthy food that's now coming into smaller places and perhaps being more available? And I guess the other side on the systems is, what is the impact on the food delivery and how they're managing the inventories and the deliveries and the carbon footprint of these deliveries? And I was just wondering if you have any comments on either of those aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting program, the Shoppers, like mini grocery stores that have been popping up. I mean, I think it does sort of inject a new healthy food retail element into a lot of communities. But my understanding was that they're not super widespread at this point. And I mean, so for example, the store at maybe Spadina and DuPont, for example, it's still, even in the better Shoppers grocery stores, there's not a huge selection of produce, for example. It's not sort of a primary location for people to pick up maybe their weekly groceries. It does serve a niche, I think, though, and that's partially why they've done it. But it is a way to sort of insert healthy food options into stores. I don't know, I haven't done a lot of work with this because it is relatively new, but thinking about the logistics of all this, I mean, I can't imagine that it's like with the supermarkets, it's, you know, they can bring their big truck and offload lots of stuff and it's cheaper for them. I'd imagine that there's some constraints to what they want to do in something like a Shoppers, where there just isn't much floor space for them to add fresh foods like fruits and vegetables to their stock. I think the business model for these smaller stores will probably continue to be non-perishable food. Now there is then the sort of, that sort of brings me to like fruit and veggie markets like throughout the city that oftentimes will access the Ontario food terminal. I mean, that's a different model, and that's something that's relatively unique to a place like Toronto or New York, for example. So, but I mean, I think it fills a gap. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I think I maybe lost the train of thought on what your question was. So
no, I was just wondering about your comments on that as something that I've observed in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it's a net good, but it is a sort of niche type of food retailer, I think, in a lot of places, and it's not very widespread, my understanding.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
I see questions by Alexander, Jason, and Kara, so we'll take them in order. Alexander, Ray?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Widener. This was a great talk, and really intrigued to see, you know, where some of this research goes as the pandemic progresses. I was on a call with the Brookfield Institute a couple weeks ago, and had a chat with one of their project managers afterwards, and they made an offhand comment that they were speaking with a major grocery chain and were told essentially this grocery chain had done an analysis and thought they only needed 4 distribution centers for the entirety of southern and eastern Ontario to meet at-home demand. And, you know, thinking through maybe some of our colleagues up at York who do a little bit more critical thought on you know, zombie cities and this idea of the gray outside of the gray. What are your thoughts around what that relationship may do with food and our changing relationship to food as, you know, we see ghost kitchens become more popular and these massive distribution centers on the private side become much more of a thing than, you know, a municipally operated or provincially operated food terminal?
Yeah, that was for delivery, the 4 distribution centers for delivery.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I imagine that could be done. I mean, that sounds like a kind of interesting logistics question, but yeah, I mean, I think it does get back to this question around grocery behavior. I mean, I think one of the things that I mentioned is that's important, that's kind of underplayed, is that there's a lot of consumer preference that comes into play. Like a lot of people like going to the grocery store. I mean, I know that sort of that activity, that sort of act is actually sort of in and of itself an activity that folks enjoy participating in. And, you know, in some cases it's sort of a privileged position. So people like going to Whole Foods to be seen or something like that. But, you know, I do think that, you know, that's kind of falling into the line of the death of cities line of thought that we're seeing, you know, like, oh, well, with the pandemic, we can all just work from home and never, you know, it's like the 1950s played out in a dystopian way, where we all just sort of drive our cars into the garage and into the tunnel and then, you know, never see anyone. But I mean, I think there's a role for grocery delivery. I think it will become a more important part of the food procurement process for a lot of households and cities as time progresses. But I think there's a lot of important questions around equity, for example, and sort of the other elements of accessibility. So there's spatial accessibility, but then there's like issues around appropriateness and, you know, the 5 A's from Pinchesky and Thomas, and financial accessibility and so on. Yeah, I mean, just because they build 4 distribution centers and say that they can handle all of Ontario's home delivery needs doesn't mean that people will do it. I guess we'll see. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, though. I think it's a really interesting question that we'll have to kind of keep our eye on as things progress. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Fascinating. Jason?
Hi. Thanks, Michael. It was really, really interesting. Yeah, on the home delivery thing, I think, you know, probably a lot of us, or a few of us here on the screen, tried it. I mean, I tried it during the worst of the pandemic when it first happened. Thought, oh, okay, but we got over it, right? So I don't know. My hunch, like my local grocery store, the parking lot was full of people doing the pickup too, driving to pick up their groceries. But then after that, now those pickup spots are always empty again, people. But you know, I wanted to ask, you know, how much of, so now you're getting into GPS tracking and phones, et cetera. And I'm wondering, how much do you think people buy groceries after work, where they work? Because the food access stuff is usually almost always tied to neighborhood, to home. But of course, most of us live and work in different neighborhoods. So I guess, to what extent do you see people shop after work in where they work? And then I guess the next part of that question is, do you think that's changed as fewer people are going to work in those traditional places where they went to work? So I guess the first one, yeah. Maybe if you don't think the first one is relevant.
So first I wanted to talk about the grocery delivery services, because I actually think that's the most interesting thing that we'll probably talk about today. But I do think that there's a space for these delivery services, and I actually think that they are complementary to urbanism in some ways, because of the sort of space requirements of supermarkets that are not feasible in dense downtown areas like Toronto. Like there's better use of space for like for housing and offices and other things and amenities and parks in like downtown Toronto than a big sprawling grocery store. Yeah. And if you can have a delivery service that then provides the same selection and quality to that population, where they don't have to own a car and drive to these locations, then you're in a good situation. And I think that's actually an important thing. But I do take your point that I think in a lot of communities we're seeing that it's it's coming and going, and some places are taking it up and some people aren't.
Well, on that, since we're on that, I mean, but what kind of world are we going to have is, like, you know, if you order Amazon and you can get it tomorrow, and you got this big gas guzzling van spewing out something so I can get a $10 thing through my Prime delivery. So it's not, it's part of urbanism, but I mean, I don't know. I'm looking for green fleets and bicycle deliveries. There's some of that starting, and that would be much more exciting, I think.
Yeah. Solar power drones, you know, those kinds of things, I think.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that's a good point. And I think that this gets back to the idea of the supply chain being an important part of all this. So what is the mode of transportation for food to the end user? Now, for most of us, it's us taking whatever mode we have at our availability, walking or a car or a bike or whatever, and going there. But in the future, it might be solar powered drones or gas guzzling diesel vans or whatever. And I think that component is actually a really important thing for us to think about. To your other question, so we're also doing some work with the StatsCan GSS time use diary. There are some people who shop for food after work, but because it's not, for most people, it's not a daily activity. People go grocery shopping maybe like once a week or something like that. That we tend to see that it's a coordinated activity. And one of the things that we are seeing in our sample is that it is usually a gendered activity, at least in our small sample. And one of the persons in a couple, when they're a coupled household, takes it on and they do it. And they're oftentimes not the one that's also maybe working, if it's a one employment or a household with only one employee or worker. So sorry, my cat here is just making an appearance. Just
cat.
Move him over here. And yeah, so it's not like so some of the early work we did was like, oh, well, what if people had access to supermarkets from work? And it's like, well, some people that might benefit them, but really most people are thinking longer term about that grocery trip, and they'll make time and space to do it. So I think with GPS, what it allows us to do is look at what are the other activities along the way, and how do those compress or expand the time allowed for a grocery shopping trip, and then subsequently cooking and cleaning activities that are related to that. Because if you don't have, if you have compressed time around when you can actually have your meal, then that's going to change your decision making about the items that you're buying and where you buy them from. So if I'm only allowed, if I've got 30 minutes every day to eat dinner and that's it, I might go to Shoppers and buy microwavable dinners, and that would be different if maybe I had 2 hours every day and I would cook a 5-course meal and I'd go to the fancy grocery store because I also have the economic access and all that stuff. So I think the real benefit of the GPS tracking technology is not that it gives us better measures of geography of access or exposure to food retail. It's that it gives us a more comprehensive geography of food behaviors generally. So it's moving away from just the access exposure element to like, what is the geography of food for urban people, if that makes sense. So, I think it's a really interesting question that you asked. It's something we are obviously thinking about. So thanks for your question, Jason. You can bug me about it later. I'm satisfied.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I see there's a question in the chat from Kara. In terms of delivery service, what's potential with more affordable and accessible service, for example, delivery based on community instead of individual households?
Yeah, that's a great idea, and I think maybe a model where delivery services could be in bulk shipped to, say, a community center or a library or something like that. That's brilliant. I think we should do that. I had not thought about it too hard before. I think that's a really, really good idea, because a lot of the cost is related to the distribution to an individual's home. So you're paying for the labor of collection and movement. And if you can improve the efficiency of that by maybe doing one shipment to a centralized location that's more accessible to a community, that would be a really good idea. I like that a lot. I have not seen that done anywhere aside from maybe there's sort of food share examples. So maybe if you belong to like a cooperative farming place, they may set up at a library and you can come get your healthy food there. But as far as I know, there's no program like that exists in Toronto. So we should do it. Thanks for the
good
question.
idea, Kara.
Yeah.
We probably have time for one quick question, Jason.
Oh, no. Someone else ask.
Oh, okay.
I'll ask if there's no one else who wants to ask. I think Andre has a question, or the thumb up anyway. No.
Andre, do you want to say anything or just signal your approval?
Okay, I'll ask a question. Do you ever see in Toronto like mini farmers markets or fruit and vegetable stands at large, dense residential towers? So in suburban London, Ontario, we'll get it on arterials. They'll be at a corner in a gas station. And sometimes it's farmer, sometimes it's food terminal stuff. But do you see in Toronto any big, like dense neighborhoods that don't have fresh fruit grocers having that?
There have been ad hoc programs in, for example, Rexdale, Scarborough, that have done this, but it's not like a consistent programming effort. And I mean, I think programs like that are interesting. They tend to sort of take one of two forms in my observation. One is they happen where the yuppies live, which is like maybe less of a problem. Well, I mean, these are folks that have economic means, and so they, it's sort of a novelty, and it's kind of fun to have it, and like it's all well and good, and it's not, I'm not casting shade on it, but it's a sort of a privileged version, or it's sort of a this sort of, maybe they got a grant and it'll last for a year, and then they run out of money, and it doesn't happen anymore. And it's sort of a Band-Aid solution to a more systematic problem around access to food. No, aside from the ad hoc sort of programs I've seen in Scarborough and Rexdale, I'm sure there's other examples in maybe Parkdale where this has happened. In my experience living in a tower for a long period of time, I never saw anything like that, but there's pretty good distribution of fruit and veggie storefronts throughout the city, and lots of little grocery stores that probably take away from the need for something like that. But it's another interesting idea.
Well, thanks very much to everybody for coming and joining us, and especially to Dr. Widener for that talk. It was very informative to tell us what's kind of going on in your research world and maybe what's possible as we go forward. I'd just like to, before I close, remind people that there's another event in this series 1 week from now on October 26th. And the speaker next week will be Professor Ryan Isaacson from the Department of Geography out at University of Toronto, Scarborough. And he'll be talking about commercialization of agriculture and food security in Guatemala. So thanks, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Tracy.
Bye.